Hi, everyone. We are going to get started. Thank you so much for being at today's panel, Decarbonizing Supply Chains for Business and Innovation. My name is Shayna Gallagher, and I am the Net Zero Engagement Manager for the British Standards Institution. For those that don't know, BSI is the UK's national standards body and UK member body to ISO, which is the International Organization for Standardization. And we will talk more about standards a little bit and the role that they are playing in supply chain decarbonization. And just to kick off today's panel, I presume that most folks in the audience are here because they either work in supply chains or for companies that are engaging with supply chains. But the context that we wanted to set as we go into this conversation is that simply the approach to decarbonizing a supply chain, if we're going to be very blunt about it, has increasingly become understood as either exclude or engage. I think it may have been Tanguy who, in fact, said that during our prep call. And that is an expectation, but of course there are enormous nuances and variation to that approach. And there are evolving expectations around supply chain when we think about culture, when we think about wider impact and influence of organizations, and we're going to get into all of that on today's panel. So please join me in welcoming our very formidable speakers. We have on my left Rishi Jain, the Director of Impact for Liverpool Football Club. Any Liverpool fans in the audience? Let's see some hands. There we go.
Two.
Listen, you know, we're
take
a bit far. Yeah, we'll take that.
so.
Better than nothing. We have Heidi Barnard, the Head of Sustainability for NHS Supply Chain. We have Tanguy Robert, the co-founder of SAMI, and Andrew Cohen, the UK and Ireland lead for One Click LCA. Now, I think probably most folks in the audience know who half of the panel are here representing, but the other half you might not be as familiar with. So if we could just start by asking the panelists to briefly, very briefly, 2 minutes or less, introduce yourselves and what you do at your organizations. Rishi, start with you.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. So my name is Rishi, Director of Impact at Liverpool Football Club. You know Liverpool, so I won't explain that bit, but my role is to lead the Red Way, which is our overarching sustainability program. So for us, as with most ESG programs, 3 pillars: people, planet, communities. Everything on diversity, inclusion, environmental work, and then our communities pillar is a little bit different. So it's the work of the LSE Foundation, the club's official charity, and then our work with our commercial partners as well. That was less than 2 minutes.
Well done. Perfect. All right. Big shoes to fill.
Follow that. So I'm Heidi Barnard. I'm Head of Sustainability for NHS Supply Chain. Hopefully most of you know what the NHS is. The organisation I work for is wholly owned by the NHS, and our role is to procure products on behalf of the NHS and deliver them into the NHS. So we have around 650,000 products in our catalogue that we deliver into trusts up and down the country every day, and increasingly into community settings and into the home delivery service, so actually to patients' homes.
Great. Thanks.
Hi everyone, I'm Tanguy Robert. I'm the co-founder and general manager at SAMI. SAMI, for those who don't know, who are probably most of people in this room, is a carbon and ESG management platform. So we support across 1,500 clients to manage their carbon footprint and ESG data. And of course, Scope 3 is a big topic for companies. And just to give you one number, so across all of our clients, upstream Scope 3, so the supply chain, is about 72% of the whole carbon footprint on average. So it's very much the most important topic when reducing emissions. So glad to be part of this panel.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrew Cowan. I work for a company called One Click LCA. We are the world-leading digital platform for life cycle assessments and for environmental products.
Andrew, sorry, a little closer to your mouth.
Okay. Does everyone hear me? Oh, I've got some thumbs up now. Okay. Sorry. So, yes, my name is Andrew Cowan. I work for One Click LCA. We're the world-leading digital platform for life cycle assessments and environmental product declarations. We're primarily focused on the construction and real estate sector and the building product manufacturers that come with that as well. We have over 500,000 data sets in our platform, and we're used in over 170 countries worldwide.
Thank you so much. So yes, it was clear from those intros, and I'm sure everyone in the audience even though we're switching channels over here, knows that the majority of most organizations' emissions are Scope 3, and of course it is the most difficult part of a organization's greenhouse gas footprint to decarbonize. So I'm expecting to learn a lot from this panel, and with that, we'll get into the conversation. So Heidi, I'm going to start with you. The NHS handles billions in annual spend with diverse supplier network, and it's, of course, a challenge, I imagine, balancing setting ambitions, mandating targets like your evergreen supplier assessment without completely squeezing out the abundant smaller SMEs that make up the majority of the UK economy and, of course, want to work with the NHS. How do you balance that?
So, interestingly, and it gets posed to me quite a lot about it being a balance and a squeeze, and actually some of our most engaged and most agile and most capable suppliers are our SMEs. So I think we need to be really mindful about not making assumptions about what an SME is and isn't capable of. So I think that's the first point. You're absolutely right. When we talk about our Scope 3, it's 98% of our impact because we are literally buying stuff. That is what we do. So we have a really important role to play, but the approach we've taken is we go through an approach where we demand signal. So most of you hopefully have heard of the NHS England Supply Roadmap. So we set out a number of years ago the route which we were going to take to allow suppliers to be ready and understand where we were going and sticking to it so that we don't shift expectations. We then put in place an awful lot of resources and support to allow suppliers and enable suppliers to deliver what it is we're looking to achieve in a stepped and progressive manner. And we are increasing the bar, so rewarding those that are actually listening to our requests and delivering on it. So you talked about the Evergreen Assessment, so that came into play a couple of years ago. We started off with it not being a level that you needed to get to. There are 4 levels you can achieve in the Evergreen Assessment. So we started off with, we just need you to have completed it, so to be registered on the platform and have completed some of the questions. So that was getting people ready for it, getting used to engaging with it and how to answer it. And also we take feedback on that platform, so understanding what questions people are struggling with, what it is they're not understanding in terms of the questions, but also beginning to understand where the gaps are and therefore where we need to put resources in place to support them to get to the next level. Earlier this year, so in April, we've now required that everybody be at level 1. So again, it's moving that bar up to make sure everybody is in line with what we're looking for, but we're also being really clear of what level 1 is. And actually a lot of what is required in level 1 has been mandatory through things like carbon reduction plans for a number of years already. So it also demystifying some of the thoughts people have around what that level means and actually showing how it's really applicable and what they're already doing counts towards that. And we have plans, obviously, to, as we move forward, to again increase the bar. But again, it's about bringing everybody with us, showing them, giving them the results and giving them the opportunity to proceed with that. And if they choose not to, that is their choice.
And there are consequences to that choice, I imagine.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. And I just want to take a moment to appreciate that the NHS has such a mature and robust supply chain engagement program. I have been fortunate to hear Heidi speak on several panels before, and I think it's really important that you're out here expressing and communicating about that. So there may not be that many organizations sitting in the audience that have the size and scale of the NHS, but really encourage you to look into what they're doing for inspiration. And Rishi, you were pretty self-identifying as having a less mature supply chain engagement program than perhaps the NHS. Did this challenge of engaging SMEs and the balance between not squeezing out smaller organizations resonate with you at all? Is that something that you've come across yet?
I think very much so, because for us, and Shane, you said it perfectly, we're a lot earlier in our journey when it comes to supply chain. I suppose one thing, and this is very similar to the NHS, I suppose, is the reputational considerations that we have. Because one thing we don't want to do is start to price out or push out the local businesses that we operate with within our community. We literally have a community interest bakery, which is in the shadow of the stadium, that we work with all the time. And the last thing we want to do is throw a load of targets at them and say, right, you need to offset, you need to do this, you need to do this. And then they just go, you know what, this isn't worth it. And that's a real challenge for us, but hopefully a journey that we can take them on.
Beautiful. Thank you. Okay, Tanguy, over to you next. So through SAMI, you work closely with emerging businesses and SMEs, of which we were just discussing, trying to map out their carbon footprint. When a massive entity like the NHS or a global corporate tightens their supplier requirements, what are the primary bottlenecks or tech anxieties that you see SMEs face?
So for SMEs, the struggle is that there's two things. One, they get required some data from their big clients. And obviously, it's a data problem that they have less resources to face. And so it's very much about how to, one, have your client be satisfied with the level of data that you can give them. And that's where it's particularly important for SMEs to make sure they use the right set of tools to have maybe a more accessible approach. So using a platform, using the right level of advisory and consultants as well to make sure that they provide really the good data for their clients. But also as an SME, they have their own supply chain that they need to decarbonize. Again, clients, big corporates, the supply chain is the problem, but it's the same for SMEs. Scope 3 is also very important. And the power dynamics are reversed because as an SME, you will ask your supply chain to do a decarbonization action or reduce your emissions, but you're a small client for them. So it's a matter of how you can engage your own supply chain as an SME, whereas you're small. Whereas you ask them, okay, could you put solar panels? Well, you're 1% of my revenues. And so what we see is different tactics happening for SMEs. One is collaboration with other SMEs or other clients. So you, for example, I'm going to give an example of one of our clients, who's Picture Organic Clothing. They're 50 million revenue sports clothing company based in the Alps in France. And Scope 3 is their major thing. Production happens in Asia mostly. They went to their biggest supplier and asked them to switch to solar panels because they were getting electricity from the grid, which is high carbon in most countries in Asia. And again, the supplier said, well, I have other clients, bigger fish to fry kind of thing. And they went to other textile companies, bigger ones, that they knew were using the same supplier. And they went back to them with a group of 4 companies, including a big one, and that changed the whole conversation, and they actually implemented that action. So I think for SMEs, it's about finding collaboration rather than one-to-one conversations, and eventually, potentially as well, rethinking your supply chain if you want to decarbonize and then make your big clients happy, or in that case, consumers for textile companies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And can you maybe from your own clients give another example, or anyone on the panel, of when an SME you've seen turn the carbon monitoring and greenhouse gas monitoring that they're doing into an actual strategic value add, or something that they're able to use to actually generate more income?
Yeah, I can do that. So one that we had actually last week, construction's very regulated. I'll probably talk about this in a bit more detail later, but construction's highly regulated. So in many ways, it's actually ahead of the game when it comes to data and managing the emissions going into buildings. So what we're seeing now is there are requirements for EPDs, the Environmental Product Declarations, being written into tenders by buyers. And we had a client that came to us. They were tendering for a £1 million project against their competitor who had an EPD, but they didn't have an EPD. So no EPD, no chance at £1 million contract. And actually, yeah, so they've gone on and they're now going through the process to get themselves up to the level where they need to be. And now they're in the chance with getting this quite sizable contract for quite a small manufacturer.
Okay, wonderful. And that is a perfect segue to the question that I was going to ask you anyway, since you invoked EPDs. So looking at the built environment and manufacturing, calculating deep product life cycles is historically quite difficult, and you've championed digital solutions like EPDs and materials passports. Can you share a little bit more about what those are, how you're working with them, and how these tools are transforming procurement from simple cost tracking into true greenhouse gas tracking, and how close are we to making that sort of data universal?
Okay, I'll give you. I'll break that down into 3 parts, succinct parts, just to be clear. So, can I just have a show of hands? Who here knows what an EPD is, an Environmental Product Declaration? Okay, that's more than I thought. Okay, so for those of you that don't, it's a standardized system. So it's based on EN 15804 plus A2. I'm sure you won't be able to remember that. Come and ask me about it afterwards if you don't. Ultimately, what it's doing is showing you, it's like the nutritional value in terms of the life cycle of a particular building product. It doesn't have to be for a building product. It can be for any sort of manufactured product, but obviously this is where our focus is. So that's what an EPD is. And I mentioned a moment ago that they're being added into tenders now, and it's, as I said, it's highly regulated in construction. So probably for 30 years we've had a certification scheme called BREEAM that is being used for non-domestic buildings here in the UK. It's actually being used globally now. And schemes like that are starting to require EPDs as part of that. So again, if you don't have an EPD, then you're not part of that conversation, and you disappear off their list of potential suppliers. So I think that's probably the most important thing. But even more importantly is the days of people in the built environment sector looking at this as how much does this cost, have started to disappear, and now people are looking at it as how much is this going to cost the climate, which I think is actually really, really important. So we work with loads of manufacturers globally, and we see lots of manufacturers that have kind of dipped their toe in the water and done one EPD. And so, like, for example, a luminaire manufacturer we worked with 4 years ago, they're actually outsourcing the EPD creation. 4 years later, they've taken it in-house, and they've now got over 200 EPDs, and they're well ahead of a lot of their competitors. So that's made quite a big difference. I promise to be succinct, so I'm going to speed it up.
Just the intros were supposed to be succinct. This is great.
And then, in terms of material passport, so the EU ESPR is obviously is launched out in the EU at the moment. We don't have that over here, but of course, if you're manufacturing in the UK, then you need to think about whether you're going to be working in the EU or not. But material passports, so part of the ESPR is the digital product passports, and ultimately what that is a passport that follows around your product, and it gives you information on what it is, what's in it, and what the end of life scenario is with that product, to keep it very simple. And the regulations start to come in for certain types of products at the moment. So we don't have that here now, but having the data ready now is going to get you ahead again of that kind of regulation that's coming in. That's super important. I'd underline that. And then in terms of broadly standardized, I'd say, well, so for the construction sector, it really is starting to happen now on all the major UK projects, and we're starting to see that across Europe and globally as well. But in the UK, probably in the next 5, 7, 10 years, I would expect to see that.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And I'm curious what the rest of the panel thinks perhaps the role of the voluntary standards are in this supply chain decarbonization work, because you're talking about regulated standards essentially for this specific sector. This past week has been a really big week for net zero standards. There was the launch of SBTi's new standard about a week and a half ago, actually, June 11th, and that includes some SME guidance as well. And then the ISO Net Zero standard opened for public consultation yesterday and has quite a lot of guidance around not only Scope 3 and supply chain decarbonization, but also the role of an organization in, once they've reduced all of the emissions that they feasibly can, externally influencing and shifting the regulatory regime and the technology regime to try and create some of the systems change that is generally a blocker to Scope 3 decarbonization. So for the rest of the 3 folks on the panel who didn't mention standards yet, is there anything you'd like to share about what you think these shifts and maturation demonstrations in the standards landscape could mean for supply chain decarbonization.
Happy to go first. It's really interesting. I actually started my career in the construction industry and was doing EPDs a number of years ago that I don't like to count. But I think in the healthcare space, whilst we're more mature in terms of engagement with our suppliers, when it comes to product category rules and standards for products, we are not as far advanced as the construction sector. And there's a number of reasons for that. If you think about just the vast array of different types of product we are buying across food, furniture, medical devices, all the way through to large tech, all the way through to bandages and dressings. It's an enormous, plus pharmaceuticals obviously. And a single set of rules does not work for that. So we've got a lot of work to do in terms of kind of codifying the different subsets to be then able to have standards that those product areas can work to have something that is actually going to be meaningful, because they could all do an EPD tomorrow, but it would be like trying to compare bananas and have a conversation around what an elephant versus a fruit tree looks like. So we've got a lot of work to do, and that is where the role of standards comes in, to help us have a common language to understand impact and to understand actually what action do we need to take and where do we go next with these things. But also not just concentrating on the product. One of the things I do get my soapbox about is the product is just the first step, and this is where things like BREEAM have been actually really market leading, is we need to think about things in terms of care pathway, because we do not use individual products within the healthcare setting in isolation. There is an entire system that works around it. So you don't use a glove on its own, you use it with a suture and a dressing and in a theatre environment. So it's how all of that stuff comes together, which is where we need to get to understand how we reduce impacts.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think for SMEs again, standards have been playing a role already for a few years, voluntary ones like SBTI or others, to help them have the right direction as to how to account for emissions or how to then set an emission and targets. They're, again, voluntary standards, and I think standards have also focused for the last few years, the voluntary ones, on the big corporates. And now to see that, you know, the SME aspect of it is really pushed is great to see. And I hope that SMEs will have the ability to align to standards a bit better. Because to be honest, for the last 5 years, SBTI has been very much about big corporates. And now we hope that we can have a bit more SMEs aligned to standards, because ultimately the big clients will want to see some kind of methodology alignment to have confidence in what the supply chain is doing.
Yep.
So I think that's great. But I think mostly to see that now it talks about systemic change or like, you know, making sure that the systemic change for the hard decarb part happens in the standards is also great. Because again, if you want to decarbonize supply chain, you have 3 options. You can, you know, help your suppliers with raising awareness, with maybe preferable conditions, you know, in the contracts, longer contracts, fixed prices, everything. And the most advanced one is rethinking the supply chain, whether by changing supplier or changing a product or making those systemic changes happen. And for that, you need to collaborate with others, as I was mentioning. And so it's great that to see that in the standards themselves, and not just be something that you have to do kind of on the side of standards because they're not broad enough.
Yes. Thank you very much. Okay, Rishi, we are going to come to you. So your work with the Red Way takes, actually very relevant to this broader shifting transformation conversation, takes supply chain decarbonization into a really unique realm where you're balancing global retail, sportswear life cycles, and intense fan engagement. And the cultural aspect of that should really be noted. And you've often spoken about translating complex climate metrics into football's emotional vernacular. So how do you leverage massive commercial and brand platform to influence behaviors up and down your retail and commercial supply chain, including your fans?
Okay, it's quite a question, isn't it? Are you sure that I used the word vernacular? That's
I saw in one place, yes.
It
was impressive from you.
Someone definitely wrote that for me. So to paint a picture, we've got 3 significant areas of emissions at the football club, all Scope 3. Fan travel is 1, and that's a challenge for all the obvious reasons: supply chain and merch. So if you look at merchandising, for example, in our last report, we evidenced that there was a 67% increase in our emissions related to merchandise, and that's something we could have sort of buried away and hidden somewhere else, but we chose not to because it's the right thing for us to do. We also know why that was the case is actually because the season that report covered, we won the Premier League, which is great, and that's essentially like what we strive for. Liverpool Football Club strives to win the biggest trophies, either Premier Leagues and Champions League. As a fan, as a colleague, etc., that's exactly what we live for. Obviously, there's a huge sort of merch impact off the back of that because people want the title-winning jersey, they want all the Champions rages, they want all this, and it's brilliant. And then we know that challenge is getting bigger for us because the last season just gone, we've switched over to Adidas as our kit manufacturer, and they've been fantastic to work with. Like the conversations we've had with them, they're understanding what they do. It's been amazing. There's a real breath of fresh air in that industry. But also, everyone, myself included, you can't wear the Nike stuff anymore. Like I've got a pair of Addies on now because that's what we do. We've all switched over, and the entire Anfield is you can't wear Nike anymore because it's all shifted. So like, not that we tell people they can't do that, but it's just what you do. So that's big. That's a big challenge for us. On the flip side, when you think about our supply chain, we've got around 4,000 suppliers in total, and that's a lot. And I talked about the diversity of those before. So the community interest bakery is like a real sort of sense of pride for the city and for the area of Anfield. It's a very working class area, and to be able to support those local organisations. We've done recent pieces of work where our new sort of match day donut supplier is a local company. We're doing stuff with Social Impact Coffee. Not sure if you've heard of them before, but they do some really nice stuff as well. And one of the standout pieces is with HM Pasties, and they use sort of ex-offenders and current sort of individuals in prison to make pies and give them an income, and those pies actually serve people in Anfield. So all that is amazing. But then on the flip side, you've got suppliers that we work with who we spend tens of millions of pounds with on huge sort of construction piece of work that we've done. Our stadium's grown to 61,000 in the past sort of couple of years or so. There's obviously a huge amount of emissions coming out with that. That's the constant battle, not battle, as to say the challenge that we are facing. One thing we have done is that we reached out to our top 25% sort of suppliers in terms of spend, went out to them and said, look, what are you doing? Do you have targets? What do they look like? Do they align with the red way? And actually about 52% of them did come back really positively and say, like, we are doing stuff, which is great. And that's very much the first step that we've taken in that journey. The next step for us is to really look at and go, do we go for the next 25%? Or do we actually target those sort of big spenders and go, can we really do something with them? What we have found is there's been one or two examples of where suppliers have come to us and said, we're actually doing a lot more than you realise. And it's actually turned into a positive piece for us because ultimately we want them to look after their own emissions for the reasons that everyone on this panel knows much better than I do, and you all do in the audience as well. And one of them is I can't name them because they'll tell me off, but they're a supplier who works sort of across football, providing a really key sort of essential service to Premier League teams. And they actually said to us, we will look after your emissions related to LFC if you do not tell any of the Premier League clubs, because everyone's going to be asking for it. And I was like, great, let's do that then. So we don't tell anyone about it, but we do give the example, and actually that shows the influence that we can have. But we are quite excited about the sort of next step in the journey and know we can do a lot more.
Okay, well, I have an immediate follow-up from that, which I bet a lot of people in the audience were going to ask anyway. Speaking of collaboration, without talking smack about any other teams, are you able to share to what extent you engage with other teams on their own sustainability programs? Because I personally am on LinkedIn. I have seen job adverts for, I think Chelsea was hiring for a sustainability manager, I think a couple other teams. So clearly this is something that is starting to evolve within football clubs. And it's really interesting to think about the supply chain of football clubs because it really does then get into the fans and the travel and the consumption and culture ultimately. So what does it look like to, if you do any of it, engage with other teams? And to what extent, what would you attribute that motivation to? Is it because your fans are asking for these programs? You're certainly not being regulated like the built environment yet. Is it just leadership choices? What do you think is motivating that?
Yeah, so to be honest, there is a lot of collaboration between the teams. So we do actually work together quite well. So the Premier League so if you think of the Premier League, you've got the 20 clubs, obviously, then you've got the Premier League as its own organisation who run that and administers sort of the governance behind that. They have done a brilliant job in bringing this all together. So we have a sustainability commitment that we've all signed up to. It isn't a stringent rule that we have to follow. There are some rules in football that you must do and some that are nice to do, but ultimately if the Premier League issue a commitment or a guideline, you're doing it because why wouldn't you? And that's quite entry level. So it works for us in terms of the leadership space. It's about having a senior person responsible for sustainability, a board member, and reporting your emissions in the next sort of 2 years since it launched. It's been about 2 years now. We were already doing that, because as I said, in that leadership position, but it also helps those clubs who are much earlier in the journey, maybe those who've just come up from the championship, to really do that in like a phased approach. You are finding that more and more clubs are sharing that sort of knowledge and best practice. What I would say is, ultimately, like, we operate in sport, we are super competitive at the same time. So whilst we may share things that maybe after we've just launched a program, we might go, oh, this is how we did it, rather than this, what we're going to do. Because ultimately, we want to all win the biggest trophies on the pitch, but also want to lead off the pitch. And what we found, particularly in the sports space, is that sustainability has become extremely commercially viable now. So we are finding that, and we find this a lot. I'm really proud to say about this, but we have partners who've come to us and said, yes, we want to partner with Liverpool Football Club, or we also want to be part of the Red Way. So for me, that's massive, because my chief commercial officer absolutely loves to hear that. I love every time he tells you that. I'm like, please, can I have that in writing, because that's the best thing you can ever say about a sustainability program that costs money. But actually, for us, our competitors are now hearing similar things. And what we are really proud of, as I keep on saying, we are in that leadership position. Pressure is on me to make sure we remain there. One thing we have done is that we haven't gone out and said we're the most sustainable football club because of our emissions numbers. It's not about that. It's about the story we can tell, the influence we can have in the journey that we're on, and we've done that through authenticity too.
Amazing. Thank you very much for that. And yeah, appreciate in advance all the work you're doing, because I'm sure I'm not the only one who was sweating profusely in a pub last night watching the England game, and it was uncomfortable. So thank you, football. All right, we're going to open up the panel for everyone now and just ask a couple broad questions. The first one being that data accuracy is often a massive tension when we think about the practical speed that is also, of course, required in all decarbonization and Scope 3 specifically. So what is one piece of advice you would have for a business to start cutting their supply chain emissions next week, even if they don't have complete data or they're feeling like it's a bit messy for them right now to be tracking those supply chain emissions? Who wants to start?
Yeah, shall I start?
Yeah.
Okay. I'd say don't worry about it. I wouldn't worry about the messiness of it. I would actually say look at your most carbon intensive product that you're purchasing and focus on that, and look for the standard generic data if you don't have it for that product, and just start asking your supply chain for EPDs, for example, for that product, and see what they can do to help you with that. Because once you start standardizing the highest carbon, the most carbon intensive products, that will start to push that down the supply chain a little bit further on. And if you just standardize it and don't worry too much about the messiness of the rest of the data, the rest of it will just come, and it will start to become cheaper and easier as they learn along the way.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I'd say talk to your suppliers as soon as you can. We see a lot of clients wait till they have better data, or they have a more structured climate strategy to engage the conversation. But I think Rishi mentioned it as well. The sooner you speak to them, the more you'll realize that maybe they have already things in place, and it's important that they know where you're going. And speaking to them is not just sending an email or requesting data once a year. It's sometimes, and we see it more and more big corporates doing that, maybe inviting all your suppliers to talk about decarbonization in your office once a year, and that creates a lot of conversations. So yeah, speak to them, but also collaborate with other sustainability managers across the industry. Again, we see a lot of siloed initiatives from some corporates in the same industry, and speak between your fellow sustainability managers from competitors. I mean, there's always the competitive aspect. Of course, it's like you want to lead, but then so one thing that we tend to say is that you will remain a leader even if you're bringing on your competitors in the initiative. If you lead that initiative, you'll still be seen as the leader. So you can combine competition with collaboration with your competitors. And we've seen this across multiple industries. In the media industry in France, there's been great things happening with collaboration, for example. So it can be done, and it should be done.
Yep. Beautiful. Thank you.
I think I'm just going to build on that. I think, to quote Mark Shaler, there's no profit on a dead planet. So you need to talk to your competitors because they have the same supply chain as you do, and we're all going to get there, or none of us do. I think the other thing I'd build on that is if we're talking about what you're going to do next week, start where you are. What are you going out to procure next week? What is it that you're doing? And you've got some really simple levers as somebody who's procuring something. You can either buy less of it, so really diving into what you're buying, why you're buying it, and do you really need it. You can buy a better version of it, or and this is where talking to your suppliers about what they're actually doing and how they've improved that product or that particular service over the last few years. Or you can buy something completely different. How are you rethinking and reframing what it is you're going out to procure? So start where you are, start with the thing you're going to go and do next, and really think through those lenses. And they don't just apply to sustainability and emissions, they apply across whatever value improvement you're trying to drive. So you will have co-benefits across all of the things you're trying to deliver.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think the point you're implicitly making is, Tanguy, you mentioned sustainability managers, but actually every organization inherently has a procurement team or function, and you can actually start having these conversations without an additional huge cost of hiring a full-time person. So thank you. Rishi.
It's quite hard to follow that, to be honest, but I think for us, it's about, we really start about what we can influence as well. So we recognise that our supply chain is incredibly diverse, lots of different challenges there, are very different in sort of our journey, but really focus on those sort of spheres of influence that we do have. So one example there is travel. So for example, obviously we travel a lot as a football club, and probably not as much as you think when it comes to like the men's first team particularly, but we know we can influence there. So we're able to speak to our travel supplier and say to them, right, we want to do something about the iconic buses that bring the team in and sort of take them around the country. So we switched them over to HVO, and that was because we had a lot of influence. We were the main sort of user there, but also it's Liverpool, so you can do that. So you've got these red buses now with a nice sort of sustainability message on the side, and you've got thousands of fans who meet them on a match day, and there's a nice little Redway logo there as well. So it's a nice bit of visibility. And then it also allowed us to look into insetting programs for our academy buses and our women's team, and also the flights that we do take, particularly those domestic ones, which are, sadly, that's just sort of part of the game that we have and the game that we're in. We've also really bought into SAF for those as well, because we've gone, okay, we have the data, we know what we control, we can actually really leverage the influence that we have, and we've done that in our own way. We couldn't necessarily do it in other areas because there are a lot of gaps there in the information that we have.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, on to the next question, which is the classic elephant in the room question for a supply chain decarb panel. And feel free to answer personally, not on behalf of your organization, if you want to make that distinction. Realistically, where does the financial burden of supply chain decarbonization lie? Go ahead.
For me, it has to be shared. Like, I can't go tomorrow to all of our suppliers and be like, right, you need to offset by next season or you can't work with us. Because if they turn around and go, okay, we'll do that, we might have ticked all my Redway boxes, but my CFO will be all over me for the wrong reasons, and that just doesn't work. So for us, very much a balanced journey that we are really excited to go on, but also want to make sure we get right. If we can take those suppliers on the journey with us, maybe start a sort of calculation with them, then start to go, okay, these are maybe offsetting programs that you could be part of, and then maybe in sort of 5 years' time, they're really starting to look after their scopes 1 and 2. We'll hopefully be in an ideal position, but that's sort of where we're at the moment.
As public procurement, we're in a very, very different space. So for us, we're not talking about offsetting yet. That is a long way down the line. We've got to look at how we reduce to begin with. There's also a real piece around what's the cost of not doing it. And this is where actually it really plays into the resilience issues we have. And a lot of the time we're seeing this real kind of duality of, if you're not reducing your emissions and working on this stuff, you're actually becoming an even more bigger risk to us, and we're having and seeing major supply chain disruptions which cost even more than actually investing in the decarbonisation in the first place. So for us, it's about understanding that much bigger picture of risk and overall cost to serve, and actually featuring this in that and positioning this in that overall cost to serve, rather than talking about it in a really siloed mentality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, unfortunate that it's gotten to this point, but I think someone here yesterday said to me that the cost just of this heat wave for the hospitality industry, for example, where there are rooms without air conditioning, has been massive. So this is not a tomorrow problem. This is happening now.
And again, if you think about the way that the heat wave is being positioned, and we talk about it, it's its impact on health. So we are the front line in dealing with heat waves and in dealing with the climate crisis, and we absolutely are aware of that. And you think, just take London Ambulance Service, they were dealing with over 7,000 calls a day, which is higher than their normal peak. So the cost to the healthcare system of these impacts is unsustainable.
Thank you. Tanguy?
Yeah, I think I'd differentiate between the cost of engaging your supply chain and then the cost of actually decarbonizing the supply chain. We've seen various examples of engaging the supply chain where you can build smart things as a big corporate, for example. One thing that we do with some corporates is they build a partnership with us to then offer a solution to all the supply chain at a discounted rate with content specific to that corporate about what they are requiring to decarbonize the supply chain. And so that one small thing that you can do, you can offer a lot of things as a big corporate for free that are not costing you actual investment, but just time from people, which can be very helpful as well. And then for the actual, and to give another example on engaging, one thing that we see as well is that, so you should refrain, and usually your CFO will say no to, pay the whole thing for your supplier, because they need to, see the cost as well to make sure that they're engaged in the long term. So they need to have this in their own operations. But we've seen, and we work with the defense industry in France, where you really target a few suppliers where you will put some money on the table to make sure that the decarbonization project that goes on, whether in manufacturing or other, happens. And so you do share the financial burden on very targeted thing. But at scale, to engage your supplier needs to kick in. Your supplier needs to be engaged. Otherwise, it won't work.
Yeah, it's a good distinction. Thank you.
So we've seen this in the built environment. We see this quite a lot already. So the mandate model that you were talking about is quite familiar to us. We see a client will mandate maybe an EPD down to its supply chain for a particular project, and that cost is really being picked up by the manufacturer. But as long as it is consistent, and the requests are consistent, then the manufacturers become quicker and easier, and they find it quicker and easier, and they get their infrastructure in place, and actually the costs start to reduce over a period of time. But also, I would say that the supply chain will tend to put the cost back into their tenders as well, so maybe the buyer's paying for it at the same time.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we are going to go to Q&A from the audience after this final question, so start thinking about if you have any questions for our panelists. But to close us off, what do you think is the biggest supply chain win we could expect in the next 5 years? And if your answer includes AI, you have to also say what your favorite chatbot is. Personally, not on the organizational level. Who wants to start?
I can go. I wasn't going to mention AI, but it's Gemini, because we have a partnership with Google Pixel.
Yeah, that's a good reason.
For me, it's if we can get to a piece of understanding where there is consistent progress instead of rather pockets of it. To be honest with you, I don't know what that looks like yet for our organization, but that's exactly where we want to be. If we can get consistency across our supply chain, then we will have done something right.
Thank you.
I think for us it's that next step of taking it from organisational level to really getting into the weeds of product area and care pathway, but focus on that care pathway. And I'm talking on the panel later, talking about a green patient is a climate friendly patient. So again, how we really begin to maximise and get people to really understand that good healthcare is only able to be delivered in a healthy environment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I think a big win would be making sure that it really scales at a global level, that all across continents, and especially in Asia, maturity levels keep going up so that you don't just provide data, but you're also engaged in decarbonization, so that European supply chains, which rely on other continents, can keep moving the needle. AI obviously will help with all the data management of supply chains, but real life actions in the factories happen with human beings. So, but yeah, to answer your question, Mistral, because I'm a proud European, and so it's one of our one of our bets. But yeah, other models too.
Thank you.
I would say don't be afraid to create your own standards or frameworks to help guide people. And I think the manufacturers that we talk to at the moment, they're actually looking for guidance from the buyers. And I would say that that's the way to really push things forward now. So it goes back to the collaboration piece. So there's no AI involved in that. In fact, this is going off piece a little bit, but my daughter told me off. She's 11 years old. Told me off for using AI this week because it's bad for the environment.
Good for her.
So that was quite interesting to hear from an 11-year-old, and I'll leave it with that.
But you also need to tell us what your favorite AI is. What were you using?
Claude.
Yeah, I'm a Claude girly too. Okay, great. Thank you. And again, we are going to go to Q&A now. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. And I believe there are roving mics that will be brought to you. It's hard for me to see. Fortunately, you can't see how shiny I am as well. But any hands? Yep. Okay, great.
Hello. My question goes to Heidi specifically, but also the rest of the floor. I work in industrial and laboratory labeling, so at the moment we work a lot with NHS trusts. And one of the questions, I've joined an organisation recently as a sustainability officer. So in relation to like your supplier roadmap, what bottlenecks are you seeing from SMEs specifically delivering detailed Scope 3 data? And what tools do you think are key to delivering net zero across your roadmap in the coming years?
So it's really interesting. So we're in a really interesting time. So a couple of weeks ago, the guidance for the next stage of what we're going to expect from suppliers was released, which is the 2027 milestone, which comes out obviously in April 2027, where we're increasing the level of requirement. So at the minute, suppliers have to report Scope 1, 2, and a subset of Scope 3. And next year, that's moving to all relevant Scope 3 elements. So in terms of bottleneck, it's really interesting. So having pulled out all the data, the subset that we currently ask for isn't necessarily their most relevant, and they actually already have more relevant data. So I think there's a bit of a misnomer around that. The other part of it is, particularly for the SME market, and particularly because we are in public procurement, there is a real, we do not want there to be a burden. So we're working a lot with tools like the SME Hub to make sure that we've got tools that are accessible to SMEs, which have barriers when it comes to cost and resources. So it's focusing in on the things that are accessible to all. And again, through the Evergreen assessment, which is free for both the NHS to use and for suppliers to input into, it's using the questions to help coach them through and understand what it is we're looking for and how to answer the question.
Anyone else on the panel want to take that one? No pressure? Okay, any other hands? This is a juicy panel of diverse supply chain decarb experts, folks. I guess you answered all their questions. Yes, there we go.
You're looking for decarbonisation in your supply chains. What would you expect a reasonable year-on-year decrease to be as a percentage?
Great question.
Well, so it really varies in the construction sector. So obviously we're working with manufacturers who are being asked to decrease. So that can vary from a few percent to some quite ambitious targets. But yeah, I think that's probably the best answer I'm going to be able to give you right now.
I'm happy to jump in. I think I don't expect a linear reduction year on year because that's not realistic. If you think about the types of actions you can take, particularly when you start getting around Scope 3, you will see little bits and then you'll see big changes depending on what the action is delivering at what point. So for example, if I think about my own Scope 1 and 2, I had a couple of years where I was steady, but over the last year, it's jumped down dramatically because we've moved offices and we've changed our leases. So that action has become kind of, it's not something that we did a little bit. You don't move an office like a little bit every month. You move in one fell swoop. So what I expect from them is for them to share with me their plan and what that trajectory looks like, and are they on track with that trajectory, not a specific percentage year on year.
I think it really depends on also where you're starting from. We see clients that have quite carbon-intensive activities, when they start their journey, and so obviously for them, the percentage, the decrease percentage will be higher and easier to achieve. For those who maybe had kind of low carbon activities already, it's going to be much harder. So that's one of the debate around SBTIs. Like, well, the decrease has to be kind of the same, depending on your starting point. But I think what we see across our customers, because we have a lot of data across more than 1,000 customers and how they reduce. So to give you the actual data, our clients reduce, so last year, so 25 versus 24, 2% on average. And absolute emissions. And economic intensity, so carbon intensity, was around 5%. So obviously this is not aligned to the Paris Agreement and what's required at the global level. And these are companies that are engaging in emission reductions already. So what I would say, whatever answer to that question is, the faster we can. Obviously, there are standards to set that emission reduction percentage year after year that you can follow, but they're hard to follow. And I think it's just, and it depends on your starting point. We see companies in business travel that, everyone was flying around the world, and so they had a very high starting point. So obviously, to achieve like 50% reduction in a few years can be achievable, but it really depends.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have another question.
A great panel, Shana, so far. My question is for Rishi, I think, to start with, but it's a general question about culture progression. You could argue we've seen culture regression in this last 5 years in sustainability, and that is really painful. The panel next door is about AI. I've been jumping across there. They're all talking about AI. Guys, we don't want to be talking about AI. We want to be talking about how do we nurture cultural progress. And I loved some of the things you said, Rishi, for example, about Nike and Adidas. And the thing that struck me is maybe Adidas could ask everyone to carry on wearing their Nike stuff. Let's just do it. And maybe when you go to the other football clubs, you can say, we just did this with Adidas. This is a great idea. What I'm pushing for is for us to put our jobs on the line, really, for culture. That would be a rude thing, Rishi. You might get sacked for that. But the idea is to put our jobs on the line for cultural progress. And I'm wondering what you guys think about that, and whether you think we should be doing that, or whether we should just be like tinkering around at the edges and hoping that things will change.
I understand what you're saying. I think for me to go to, in real terms, for me to go to Adi and say, encourage people to wear your direct competitors, well, it's just not, that's not the reality of the world.
You're Liverpool, Rishi, you're Liverpool Football Club.
I know, but that's also not the reality of the industry. I think if you took that out of a football context and said to any other industry, and you said, go and use your competitors program, I don't think many, if any, organisations with a commercial mindset would really be able to go and do that and go, we're standing by our values as well as our commercial targets. For us, when it comes to our influence, obviously we talk a lot about our influence to our supporters and what we can do, especially when we use our most recognisable and biggest voices, i.e. our players, our head coaches across our men's and women's teams as well. That's where we know we've got a really big influence and opportunity to do that. We haven't quite connected that to our supply chain yet. Asking a player to talk to supply chains and decarbonising supply chains, is that authentic? Is it genuine? It's probably not, and actually would people really take that in? They probably wouldn't. So actually, hearing from the other panelists today, I've got loads of thoughts already about how we can engage and use the culture that we do have as a football club and flip that maybe into that more business setting. To answer your final part of your question about should we put our jobs in a line, I think to an extent, yes. But for me, speaking sort of personally and professionally, it's a constant balance. And I'm not saying about it's a compromise. It's not like, oh, we won't do this sustainability piece of work because actually commercial growth is more important. It's about how can you balance the two. So the best example I can give you is football generally. So ultimately, every season we want to play 67 matches per season because that takes you to the final of every single competition, and hopefully you win in the lot and you've completed football. With that comes a huge amount of fan travel, more waste, more fans, more everything. But that's where we want to be. So I'm like, okay, that's our ultimate goal. I would not be doing my job if I didn't recognise that was our goal. But what can I do around sustainability and the influence that we have to add in decarbonisation strategies and statistics into that so they can go side by side?
Mm-hmm. There's a piece you've just said that made me think of something, but I want to come back to the broader point around culture. So is your growth, commercial growth, is it sustainable? So there's a real question here around if all you're doing is growing for growth's sake, there is a finite limit to that. You need sustainable growth if you want to be still making money in a year, 2 year, 5 year, 10 years time. And it goes back to that. There's no profit on a dead planet. So you're kind of biting the hand that feeds. I think going back to the culture piece, there's a really interesting report that came out a couple of weeks ago from the King's Fund, which looked at people's impressions and attitudes towards the net zero program within the NHS. And we looked at it by political voting approach, which is interesting reading. So the obvious things come out when you start talk about the more right-wing parties in terms of reform and restore voters, in that they had a real visceral reaction to words like net zero and climate change. However, when you start talking to them about waste and resource use, they are all in favour of that. So I actually think it's not a culture and behaviour problem, it is a language and how we talk to people problem. And actually, if we start talking in language that people understand, then they are far more likely to actually go, oh, no, that's a really good idea. We shouldn't be wasting stuff, and we should be, having efficient and reusable devices and reusable things in the NHS. But it's all about that language and the story people think about and that they understand, which has, again, from a cultural point of view, we've got to shift how we talk about these things.
Thank you, Heidi. Go ahead.
I think it's a great question. I love that question because it's also our role. So I say our as a service provider, platforms or advisory firms in general, who are pushing companies to do things. I think as service providers, we do need to make sure that we are pushing the ambition within the company, and that even as a software provider, that applies. You could say, well, you're just a software platform. You have to put data in and put data out as CO2 and allow your clients to track their targets, and that's fine. But there's a lot of things that you can do as a software provider to push that ambition. An example, in our platform, you have a decarbonization action library that you can just browse the platform to. And a lot of the actions are, really about business model change or things that are not really accounted for in carbon accounting, but are still kind of, your impact because of the service that you provide. And another example is we got a lot of clients in the service industry, so service providers, software providers themselves, or advisory firms, and a lot of their supply chain is, Google, Microsoft, and the big ones. And they were like, well, that's 5% of my emissions for the ones that have big cloud operations. I'm no one compared to Microsoft. Well, what am I going to do? And so what we did, and I think, software providers could do that, advisory firms could do that, is, well, why don't you, join the other 200 service provider clients that we have and all push the same email to customer support asking, more data or more engagement from that specific supplier. I mean, it could be any supplier. So I think it's you have to push that ambition, and you have to make sure you don't fall into, I'm just a service provider here to give you numbers, but I'm actually here to push ambition.
I think we're at time, but Andrew, would you like the last word?
Sure. I'd say real estate's quite culturally collaborative when it comes to the sustainability side of things. So people like the Better Building Partnership have been excellent at bringing things like neighbours into the across into the UK, and even the manufacturers, they have their own associations and they're getting together, they're building their own association EPDs. Even though they're all sworn enemies out on the street, they're all working together to do that. So we're seeing quite a lot of that. And to your point as well, we have a free academy. Students can use our software for free. So we're putting that out there as well.
Thank you so much. Okay, we are at time, but please join me in thanking our incredible panel. We've made a lot of progress on supply chain decarbonization. I've been doing these panels for several years now, and I'm very hopeful and inspired by how far we've come, and we've still got a long way to go. So looking forward to working with you all on that, and thanks everyone for listening.